Welcome, good evening, and welcome. If you haven't met me, I'm Mary Miller. I'm director of the Getty Research Institute. I introduce many speakers here at the GRI, but it is a particular pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who will be giving the inaugural lecture in the Getty Pre-Hispanic Art Provenance Initiative, a multi-year project here at the Getty Research Institute to build an international history of the trade and business in works of pre-Hispanic art as documented in the recently donated Stendahl Gallery archive. I didn't expect that. For our project, scholars from around the world, and especially from the United States and Mexico, but I know there are many people who represent the museums of Europe here, so just saying you're in the project as well. Scholars from around the world will study the archive. We hope that this process will foster collaboration among institutions with complementary records from Leiden to Berlin to Mexico City, each of which holds missing pieces of the puzzle of how it is that pre-Hispanic art began to be known as just that, art, and generally left the confines of the Anthropology Museum for the Art Museum. This work extends the Getty Research Institute's decades-long commitment to provenance research, which has included comprehensive study of the early American art market, the digitization and analysis of art sales records from the 17th and 18th century documents of Britain, and reconstruction of Nazi movement of art during the Third Reich. The Pre-Hispanic Initiative is also part of Ancient Worlds Now, a future for the past, a 10-year effort starting now to address threats to pre-modern cultural heritage around the world. Tomorrow, and in this very space, we will be hosting a conference in which the history of pre-Hispanic collecting before the age of Stendahl will be our subject. How did explorers and ambassadors and travelers and artists form collections of pre-Hispanic art in Mexico, and what happened to these collections? To this end, we start tonight with a provocative talk, Good Pieces in Sight, the US market in Mesoamerican art, circa 1940, from Megan O'Neill. She, along with Matthew Robb of the Fowler Museum, just across the 405, and Joanne Pillsbury, now at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, but a very fondly remembered member of the Getty Research Institute. Joanne, everyone seems to think you're almost still here. How they inaugurated conversations with the heirs to the Stendahl Gallery, the archive that lies at the heart of the larger picture. Megan O'Neill explored the question of provenance for her first book, Engaging Maya Sculpture, when she found herself tracking down the fragmented remains and maimed carcasses of the great monuments of Piedras Negras in the back rooms of US museums and the warehouses in Paris suburbs. In her work as a curator at LACMA and at Emory, where she is now a faculty member in the art history department, Megan has dug deeply into the chain of ownership, regardless of how unsettling the answers may be. As we have launched this project, Megan has been a part of the story from the start. Accordingly, it is with great pleasure that I welcome her to the podium here at Getty.
Wow, thank you so much, Mary, for that beautiful introduction. Before beginning, I just want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples and pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. So I'm so happy to be here tonight, and there are so many friends in the room and colleagues, and I'm really honored that you are all here, and especially nervous that you are all here. And I will thank you all for your comments for this project, which is an exciting and new and preliminary project that I am 100% sure will involve many more people in the future. So I want to thank Mary Miller and Kim Richter for organizing this conference and inviting me to speak tonight. Thanks also to the GRI, the Morgan Library, and to Ron and April Damon, the last owners of the Stendahl Galleries, for giving me access to their respective archives and permission to show the materials. Now, my talk tonight is about the US market in Mesoamerican antiquities circa 1940, but I begin closer to the present with the topic of object amnesia. For her 2017 installations in Los Angeles and Mexico City, Los Angeles-based artist Gala Porras Kim addressed the Proctor Stafford collection, comprising more than 200 West Mexican ceramic sculptures gathered by LA businessman Proctor Stafford. For one part of her artwork, Porras Kim drew the sculptures according to size, one characteristic that is known and provable. But one point of the drawings and the whole project is what is not known, since any information about where they came from or who owned them before Stafford did not accompany the objects. The 1970 catalog of the collection lists the sculpture's Mexican states of origin, and a circa 1970 radio interview, now posted online, Stafford mentioned he first bought objects from the Stendahl Galleries in Hollywood and later acquired some pieces in Mexico from artists Diego Rivera and Miguel Covarrubias and from farmers and industrialists in West Mexico. This is tantalizing information that leaves us wishing to better illuminate the subject. But there are no records about which objects came from which person, where they were deposited in antiquity, or where they stopped along the way. These gaps in the provenance history of these objects frustrated Porras Kim and underlined one of the main points conveyed in her work. But this paucity of information is typical. As with many US museum collections of Mesoamerican art from private collectors and the art market, little to no information about provenance accompanies the objects. Recent guidelines from the American Association of Museum Directors recommend the recording of more information, but it often does not exist, since one common practice in the market was to strip objects of information, to intentionally erase or simply lose by not recording the memory of where they came from and where they had been. In fact, in aggregate, the acts of the art market have constituted intentional and unintentional erasures of memory, creating object amnesia. Now, frustrated by the limited knowledge about these object origins, Porras Kim developed a new system for tracking objects. She created new ceramic vessels, which she called future artifacts, whose forms recall but diverge from the ancient West Mexican ones. Notice there's a banana right here. And added GPS trackers to follow them in time and space, thus making them sentient about their journeys and keeping her updated as to their whereabouts. Porras Kim also made drawings of spaces where the ceramics might have been in the meantime, as on a collector's mantle on the left, or in a West Mexican tomb, dark and unseen, on the right. Through these efforts, she endeavored to return histories to objects whose memories had been erased, and to ensure the retention of memory of her future artifacts. Now, this is an artist's commentary, and she's wonderfully humorous and challenging and lovely. It's an artist's commentary on an inherent problem arising from the vicissitudes of the 20th century art and antiquities market. But how can curators, art historians, and historians also respond to this problem? One strategy, which I and the speakers in tomorrow's symposium, as well as other people, have been undertaking is to investigate the market and see how far we can get in uncovering objects' origins and the networks of people, objects, acquisitions, and sales through which the objects moved. The 1993 Dumbarton Oaks volume on the collecting of pre-Columbian art was an excellent early endeavor in which artists, art historians, curators, and archaeologists discussed individual objects and collecting patterns and networks. Notable essays were Betty Benson's article on the Robert Woods Bliss collection at Dumbarton Oaks and Michael Coe's essay on the networks of object movement between Mexico and the US, in which Coe named US dealers and the people in Mexico who supplied them with objects. But much information was still missing. But now, in 2019, we have unprecedented access to detailed stories of many individual transactions and communications, and can enter a new phase in understanding these systems and the objects in museums throughout the world that passed through them. We can enter this phase because of newly available archives of art and antiquities dealers like the Stendahl Art Galleries, now at the Getty, archives inside museums and auction houses, and private papers of people involved in the trade or acting against it. April Damon's wonderful book about the Stendahl Galleries traces the outlines of the gallery's long history, based both on the archive and family lore. Indeed, these and other archives contain a world of information that we are only beginning to understand. Through this research, we can begin to recover the lost memory of some of the thousands of Mesoamerican objects in foreign museums. By recreating their itineraries and the networks that led to their dispersal from their original homes to cities across the globe, we can strive to reverse the amnesia forced upon them. So the primary subjects of my talk tonight are the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York City, whose archives are in the Morgan Library, nearby where Matisse's gallery was located on East 57th Street, and the Stendahl Galleries, founded by Earl Stendahl and opened for 100 years in LA before its closure a few years ago. This talk uses preliminary research in both archives to explore the changing and growing US market in antiquities from Mexico and Central America in the 1930s and 40s, particularly in the shift from Paris to US cities like New York and LA, coinciding with World War II. We've long been able to discern a shift in the market in the art of the ancient Americas from Paris to the US, but the archives reveal more detail about changes in global politics and the market that limited some people and gave others new opportunities. And the market was forever transformed, not to be reversed even with the war's end, and expanding in its new configuration over subsequent decades. Now, people at multiple levels and in multiple countries, including Mexico, participated in this trade and supported and depended upon each other's actions, although others elsewhere worked to stop the trade and the associated ravaging of archaeological sites. But the US dealers cultivated buyers and sales through exhibitions in their galleries or in art clubs, public fairs, and museums, including ones organized by the Mexican government, which inadvertently functioned as advertising for the gallery's wares. Now, before diving more deeply into Matisse and Stendahl, I want to think about them in relation to the art market in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. And I know tomorrow we'll learn more about the markets in the 19th century and earlier in the 20th century. So please come back for those talks. I can't wait. Now, both Matisse and Stendahl started as dealers of more contemporary art. Matisse focusing on what we call modern, but then contemporary French art, such as that of his father, Henri, and Stendahl sold art from California and later added European art to his portfolio. Both had active exhibition programs in New York and Los Angeles, respectively. April Damon notes that when the Stendahl Gallery was in the Ambassador Hotel on Wilshire Boulevard between 1921 and 1932, Stendahl held an average of 10 shows a year. Both Matisse and Stendahl added pre-Hispanic art to their holdings in the mid-1930s, following a model established by Parisian dealers such as Charles Raton, who bought and sold modern and historical European art, as well as non-European art, including arts of Africa, Mexico, and Peru. Matisse and Stendahl began communicating in 1931, and it's so fun to see the letters in both of the archives to each other and also the secrets that they were telling about each other. So in 1931, Stendahl wrote Matisse about bringing an Henri Matisse show to the West Coast. In 1935, Matisse asked Stendahl if he wanted to take a show of artworks from Africa, Americas, and Oceania. Now, these were from the collection of Raton, who was working to expand his sales to the US. Matisse then worked to extend that network to the West Coast, so we're spreading across the American continent, North American continent. And he also suggested Stendahl involve West Coast collectors like Walter Arensberg to increased interest, although that show ultimately did not travel to LA. At the same time, both men were experimenting with the identity of their galleries. By that 1935 letter, Stendahl had changed his letterhead from Stendahl Art Galleries Fine Painting or Stendahl Pictures to simply Stendahl Art Galleries at left. And on the back of a June 1935 letter from Stendahl to Matisse at right, Matisse sketched potential designs for a gallery logo to say not just modern art, but, and you can see it up here in the left, I hope it's legible, but it says, primitive sculptures, primitive cultures, ancient art of America, modern paintings. And this is one thing that Mary's saying, if you digitize your collection, scan the back of the letters too, and the photos. There's so much information on them. The ability to expand to these other types of artworks depended especially on Matisse's connections to French dealers like Raton. Another significant model for Matisse was Joseph Brummer, who along with his brothers ran the Brummer Gallery in Paris and New York, the latter site opening in 1914, which handled art from Europe, Africa, and the Americas, ancient to modern. Now, and here you can see, in addition to the photo of Brummer, this card. The Cloisters Library has put the Brummer cards online, and there's so much information. This is a piece that was sold to Matisse in 1938 by Brummer in New York. Now, in seeking clients for the ancient Mexican and other artworks, Matisse and Stendahl reached out to private clients, museums, and board members who had already bought modern art from them, working to cultivate clients with eclectic interests, analogous to what had been happening in Paris. The intermingling of these parts of the business is manifest in the Matisse stock books. One, this one right here, a converted address book that uses the alphabetical tabs to organize the types of art. Under M, for example, are Matisse, Modigliani, and Mexico. And under P are primitive art, Peru, and Picasso. And we saw one of these same books in the Stendahl archives today, which I hadn't known was there. Or in this Matisse stock book, organized by inventory number, which followed the order of acquisition, we see, oops, I thought I had put the text here, but hopefully you can see Leger, Moreau, Mexican, Moreau, Balthus, Mexican, Todonac, Duran. So this mixture of when he's buying, how he's recording them. And Matisse's correspondence with collectors and museums also often mixed discussions of the ancient Americas and modern art, as well as Africa, Oceania as well. Now, as the scholars Leah Saint-Ramond and Elodie Vaudry have discussed, there were pieces from ancient Mexico and Peru in Paris as early as the 16th century. The numbers increased in the 19th century during a period of intense diplomatic and cultural relations between France and Mexico. There was another rise in interest in Paris in the late 20s and 30s, with museum exhibitions at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris and elsewhere, including the Ancient Arts of America, which featured 1,250 objects from the Trocadero Museum, Mexico's National Museum, and Parisian collectors and dealers. Surrealist artists also showed great interest, most visible with the exhibition Exposition Surréaliste d'Objets at Raton's Gallery in Paris, which displayed surrealist art and indigenous arts of the Americas. Saint-Ramond and Vaudry note that these exhibitions fed the market and contributed to the success of multiple auctions in which thousands of objects from the ancient Americas were sold to collectors and dealers who then sought new markets for them. And they note that in the 1936-37 auctions, there were 438 different purchasers, including major dealers like Raton, Ernst Ascher, and Charles Vignier. Now, in a November 1932 letter, this is where I see the beginning of the communication between Matisse and Raton. Raton introduced himself to Matisse about obtaining a catalog from a show in New York on African art, though I wonder if he was also looking to expand his business at that point. And it was by 1934 that they were communicating about Matisse hosting an oceanic art exhibition from Raton's collection. In 1935, Matisse hosted an exhibition of African sculptures and then Peruvian textiles, pottery, and sculptures from the Raton collection. And in 1936, Raton sent an exhibition of his America, Oceania, and African collections. So you can see the catalog on the right. The lists of pieces that Raton consigned to Matisse, along with their prices, are saved in the Morgan Library archives. These exhibitions resulted in some sales. For example, in 1935, Matisse sent Raton funds for the sale of 3 African items and 1 ancient Mexican mask, though there were more as well. So Matisse wrote to potential clients to sell other pieces. In a November 1935 letter to California collector Wright Ludington in Santa Barbara, Matisse emphasized the rarity of access. I quote, "Since it has been impossible to export anything of value from Mexico, fine works of art of the pre-Columbian period have become very rare. Once in a while, I am able to secure from old European collections some of the pieces which have been brought over years ago and have been able to build up a very fine collection of figurines in semi-precious stones." And he was certainly referring to the pieces from Raton. Now, Raton's lists reveal that Matisse's story of the old European collections is a bit more complex. For 7 of the items, including ancient Mexican sculptures in precious stones, are noted Ancienne Collection PD, Ancient Collection or Old Collection PD, which took a little while to figure out, but stands for Porfirio Diaz. Mexican president who was forced to resign and was exiled from Mexico in 1911 when he went to Paris, dying in 1915. Diaz must have taken his collection to France when he was exiled. This is one of those offered pieces. The objects were thus not only from an old European collection, but from an even older Mexican collection, and part of the practice of Mexican elites collecting antiquities. Now, when Diaz was exiled, the objects were effectively exiled too. Betty Benson noted in 1993 that Robert Woods Bliss, who later donated his collection to Dumbarton Oaks and Harvard University, bought a miniature Teotihuacan mask from Bremer that had been owned by Porfirio Diaz and sold by his widow in Paris. The Bremer archive reveals that Bremer bought it from Raton in 1934 and that Joseph carried it in his pocket to the US. It was the following year that Raton offered the 7 objects to Matisse. And what's also notable is the breaking up of that Diaz collection, some to Raton, at least 1 to Bremer, and potentially other objects elsewhere. And it's not uncommon for the art market to separate pieces that were once together. Although I've not yet identified what these pieces are or where they are now, I hope we can find them. Because it's important to think about these objects' collective biographies, considering them in relation to the pieces with which they were once associated, both in antiquity and modern times. Matisse's stock books show he purchased multiple items from Raton in the mid-30s, including an Aztec panel, a Maya vase, and a Peruvian gold cup exhibited at the Fogg Museum at Harvard in 1940, one of several exhibitions of the ancient Americas that year that displayed loans from museums, collectors, and dealers, and increased collectors and museums' interest in these works in the US. Matisse also bought from Ernst Ascher, another Parisian dealer who dealt in, as his 1938 letterhead states, and you can see it up here, modern art, antiquities, and ethnographic pieces. And here is Ascher with Picasso and the photographer Stanley. And I thank Jonathan Stanley for providing me a copy of this unpublished photo from his family. Now, from Ascher, Matisse purchased a head of death god Acha in 1935 and sold it to the Smith College Museum of Art a few months later, a Mexican snake in the center that he sold to Walter Arensberg in 1937, and an Aztec maize goddess that he sold to the Brooklyn Museum, as well as items from other cultures, including a cycladic piece. And when Matisse was trying to sell pieces from Ascher, he emphasized again the rarity of access. Writing in 1937 to R.J. McKinney, director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, "I've brought these sculptures over from Paris, and it is impossible now, as you may know, to import anything from Mexico." Close quote. Matisse also bought from the Brummer Gallery in New York, having located his own gallery near their New York City gallery, and likely looking to the Brummer Gallery as a model of what he wanted to create. Opening in Paris in 1909 and in New York in 1914, the Brummer Gallery sold diverse artworks to important private collectors and museums. In fact, the Brummer Gallery sold Bliss, his first ancient Mexican piece, in Paris in 1912, beginning his journey as one of the major collectors of this art of his time. The Brummers themselves bought from a variety of sources, including Raton in Paris, as well as William Spratling in Taxco, Mexico. Spratling appears to have been an important source for ancient American objects for Brummer, and also was a source for Matisse in 1938. So things are starting to change. Starting in 1938, new sources from Mexico appear in the Matisse archive, a topic to which we will return. But I'm going to drink a little water. So now we are in 1938, 1939. And I want to think a bit more about where we are in global history and politics. As you all certainly know, 1933 and later saw the rise of the Nazis in Germany and their spread across Europe, and relevant here, the occupation of Paris in 1940. World War II soon followed. And as we all know, World War II caused incredible disruptions across the globe, resulting in the death and displacement of many people. And it also affected many types of businesses, including the art market. It's a topic studied extensively for other fields, including European art, especially as many families' artworks were seized or sold under pressure as people fled or were otherwise forced from their homes or places of exile. These events also affected the market for the art of the ancient Americas, a topic less explored but potentially intertwined. Saint Raymond and Vaudry note that many of the sellers of those 1936-37 auctions of pre-Hispanic art in Paris had come from Germany. Were they forced to liquidate their holdings? Did the Nazis thus indirectly inject energy into the ancient Americas market at this time? Questions to be answered. And we do know of multiple artists and dealers who were forced from their homes and businesses during those years. In 1938, Pierre, who handled African, Oceanic, and modern European art, and from whom Matisse did buy, here's his name, in one of Matisse' stock books. He had to shut his gallery because of anti-Jewish laws in France, and as John Russell notes, his business never recovered. As I quote from Russell, that he was, in effect, evicted from both his gallery and from his native country, and then refused admission to the United States, were blows from which Loeb never altogether recovered. The Brummer Gallery under Ernest Brummer in Paris also moved out of Paris in May 1940 and permanently shifted to New York. And some of the artists whose art Matisse carried had to come to New York, and he took advantage of their presence and also helped them by highlighting their work in multiple exhibitions, including the 1942 exhibition, Artists in Exile. But the fear was also personal for Matisse, as he wrote repeatedly to friends and colleagues in Paris, inquiring about the fate of friends and artists in danger. One set of correspondence in the Matisse archive concerns Ernst Ascher, the aforementioned Parisian dealer from whom Matisse bought items. In October 1938, Ascher started mentioning problems. Quote, "Here the affairs are less than calm, as you can imagine, and we need liquid money. I'm counting on you." And in February 1941, in a handwritten letter on gray paper, not his letterhead, Ascher asked Matisse for help getting a visa to leave France and go to New York and possibly work with Matisse. I quote, "After having suffered for a long time, I wonder what the future holds for us." Matisse also communicated with Raton about Ascher, who by 1941 had moved to the south of France, but was still trying to escape to New York, and to these ends was attempting to liquidate his art holdings. Both Matisse and Raton tried to help, working to pay for his passage and trying to use their connections to secure him a visa, but to no avail. On September 15th, 1941, Ascher wrote Matisse again, this time a handwritten letter on white paper with a torn edge. Ascher thanks Matisse for his help, but still needs help getting a visa, asks him to be a sponsor, also writing, quote, "I only ask for something modest so as not to starve." In December 1941, he writes again from Sanary in southeastern France, typing a letter on a very small piece of paper with cut edges. He thanks Matisse for depositing money for his passage to the US, but he still cannot get a visa. His desperation is apparent in his words and evident in the paper he uses. On the right, that small piece of cut white paper, so different from the elegant polychrome stationery of only 5 years before. It's hard to describe my emotions while reading the Ascher folder in the Matisse archives. Would he survive? While working in the Morgan Library archive, I cheated and skipped to the end of the folder. I couldn't take it. And I found that in July 1945, Matisse received word that Ascher was living near Paris. He survived the war, but his business was ruined. This is part of the story of the shift of the market from Paris to the US that's filled with heartbreak and devastation. Sadly, the fate of other friends was not so positive, as happened with so many others during this period. I'm not really sure how to transition to the next section, so I'm just going to jump right in and return again to 1938-39. For conflict in Europe also affected the US dealers' access to artworks coming from Europe, and Matisse, as well as Stendahl, turned more to sources in Mexico. The timing coincided with a larger turn to Mexico within the US, aligning with the good neighbor policy that President Franklin Roosevelt had initiated to improve relationships within the Americas. What we see next is the Matisse archives reveal small-scale imports from Mexican art dealers. In letters from mid-1935, Carolina Amor of the Galería de Arte Mexicana wrote Matisse, having been encouraged by painter José Clemente Orozco to see if he wanted to be part of her new gallery, showing paintings, drawings, and engravings by what she called the best modern Mexican artists, which they were. She and Matisse communicated first about buying and selling books about Mexican art, and the letters soon turned to the availability of Mexican antiquities. In later letters between Matisse and Carolina or her sister Inés, they discussed the organization of exhibitions by Mexican artists Orozco and David Alfaro Izquierdos for contemporary art was their primary specialty. But they also began to communicate about the Galleria's ability to obtain antiquities. In June 1939, Matisse went to Mexico and visited the Amors. During this trip, he purchased 7 ancient Mexican objects, and you can see them listed here, and 1 Siqueiros painting. According to his notes, 5 antiquities, I don't want to show you that yet. 5 antiquities came from Inés Amor, and it's hard to read here, and I don't know why I had these texts, but that's Amor's name here, that's Amor there. 5 antiquities came from Inés Amor, 1 from William Spratling, and 1, a stela from Veracruz, from the Mexican artist Diego Rivera. We've long known that Rivera was a collector of Mexican antiquities, and although we know anecdotally that Rivera sold items out of Mexico, as Stafford had noted in that interview, we haven't had details of specific items, at least as far as I know, but maybe some of you can tell me. The stela is now at the Tucson Museum of Art. Knowing it was owned by Rivera extends the memory of this object's itinerary back 1 step, a bit closer to its origin. We learn in other documents that Matisse purchased multiple Mexican antiquities from the Mexican artist Roberto Montenegro in 1940. As in Paris, the trade and interest in Mexican art, ancient and contemporary, went hand in hand as Mexican artists looked to the ancient past for pleasure and inspiration. But Amor and Matisse had to get the items out of Mexico. As Inés wrote in December 1939, quote, "I have someone who can go to San Antonio, Texas for 1,000 pesos, nothing less. I trust him entirely, and maybe my brother can go with him," unquote. Matisse was instructed to arrive in San Antonio to collect the items. It worked, but it took many years for him to sell the stela, which he sold to Frederick Pleasance in 1950 and netted a substantial profit. Pleasance later donated it to the Tucson Museum. But there was a problem with 2 ancient Mexican masks that had come from Amor. Upon presenting the masks to George Vaillant at the American Museum of Natural History, Vaillant proclaimed them fakes, writing, quote, "They are unquestionably modern imitations of ancient Mexican sculpture. I know this style of falsification very well, having seen a number of other fakes of this same nature." Learning he had purchased fake items from Mexico hit Matisse hard, personally and financially. His accounting files, one of them on the right, report an economic loss, and his father, Henri, felt the need to comfort him in a letter from 1940, quoted in John Russell's book. And I'm going to read the whole quote, because it's quite interesting. "You and I have not always agreed on this subject, but I believe that we learn by experience. What happened to you is nothing extraordinary. I don't believe there is an art dealer, no, not even Brummer, who has not been in your position. It's the same is true of artists. What amazes me in cases of this sort is that the people who buy fakes don't realize from one day to another that the object that meant so much to them has actually nothing to give. It's rather like the story of love." Unquote. Matisse had another unfortunate incident related to Inés Amor, who wrote him in December 1940 regarding, quote, "an extraordinary thing, an alabaster vase almost identical in shape to the obsidian one on the monkey in the National Museum of Mexico." Matisse responded with multiple queries and ultimately sent a deposit, and they communicated how to get it to New York. But the letters reveal he had some competition. Can you guess who? Earl Stendahl. Earl Stendahl kept making offers to Amor for the vase, as she wrote, S, period, from Los Angeles is back in Mexico and again trying to get your painting. Referring to the vase as a painting is one example of the code they used to refer to antiquities in some letters, perhaps because they knew censors were reading them. And regarding Stendahl, she wrote, quote, the more I see of him, the more I distrust him, unquote. But she eventually succumbed, selling the vase to Stendahl, and she wrote to Matisse that the resulting guilt was causing her a nervous breakdown. Their relationship made vulnerable by her own betrayal, especially worse because it was to his rival, Stendahl, who, as we learn elsewhere, was increasingly cornering the market in Mexico. As Matisse wrote to Amor, quote, I would prefer not to be in such direct competition with S, who talks too much and has no discretion nor discrimination. Again, these secrets that they don't say to each other directly. But it may have been those personality traits that contributed to Stendahl's ultimate success in the market. Stendahl soon sold this vase to Bliss, one of the most famous collectors of pre-Hispanic art of the time, and the vase was displayed in multiple exhibitions in 1942 at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, the DeYoung Memorial Museum, and the Portland Museum of Art, where it was a representative not only of the beauties of the art of the ancient Americas, but also of the rising power of Stendahl in the art market. And today, it's in the Dumbarton Oaks collection. Now, around 1939, Matisse began to communicate with Raul de Hesa, a relative of Teodoro de Hesa, governor of Veracruz, for 5 terms, from 1892 to 1911, coinciding with the reign of Porfirio Diaz and also ending with the revolution. Raul de Hesa was selling items that had once belonged to the governor, including 2 Palma sculptures that allegedly had been found with 3 others in the collection of Mexico's National Museum. This example, as well as with that of the Diaz items offered by Raton, gives a bit more insight into a world we know less about, though Maruna knows more, and Adam, who is speaking tomorrow, that of the Mexican elite owning their country's antiquities, of the porous boundary between Mexican national and private collections, and of objects from the same locale being split between becoming national patrimony or saleable items with a monetary value within and outside Mexico. Remaining in the archive also are photos that de Hesa sent him of other items, including a mask and ball game yoke, also from Veracruz. Now, photographs were essential to potential sales, and thus Matisse, Stendahl, and other dealers often requested photographs from their sources in Mexico that they could then use to try to sell items in advance before they were exported. The visual language of these photographs is extremely interesting. Although some just placed objects on sidewalks or house furniture, as with these from circa 1940 that were offered to Matisse, others were photographed with cloth or paper in the background, modeling museum and catalog photographs with the object and center. But in this photo, which I think came from Guillermo Echanes, aforementioned Mexican dealer, the cloth or paper was shifted, or the camera drifted slightly away, revealing a planter, a sign of a Mexican house in the background, a place of domesticity transformed into a locale for the international art market. And I want to show you one more from the Stendahl archives of this very sad Colima figure, perhaps a warrior, who's shown with this Guerrero's matchbox as scale. Probably these are from Jorge Hauswalt in Mexico. And again, where the camera drifts or the paper slips, and we see what is behind this sort of illusion of the object at center against the background. And there's a whole lot of work to be done with these kinds of photographs. But back to Matisse. My preliminary study of Matisse's stock books reveals the shifts in his purchases. From 1935 to 38, Matisse bought ancient Mexican and Peruvian objects from the Parisian dealers mentioned before, Raton, Asher, Vignier, and others. But beginning in 1938 and continuing for the next few years, he buys instead from Mexican sources, including Spratling, Amor, Rivera, Montenegro. And he also buys from Stendahl, who also obtained pieces directly from Mexico. He did buy a few items from Raton during the war, but his sources are primarily, at least for ancient Americas, are primarily within North America. And Matisse, despite his extraordinary early acquisitions in ancient Americas, did not become a major player for pre-Hispanic art, moving more towards contemporary artists from Europe, the US, and Latin America, for which he became a truly major player. On the other hand, Earl Stendahl was about to engage in an astonishing rise, involving large-scale acquisition of objects directly from Mexico and other countries, aided by agents and dealers in those countries who knowingly participated in these operations. Who were his sources? We see some communication with Spratling and Amor, but his major acquisitions come through partnering with Guillermo Echanes, who also sold to collectors inside Mexico. And here is one of the invoices from 1941. Echanes was a book dealer in Mexico City who became a major source for the Stendahl Galleries starting in 1939-1940. Stendahl family lore is that they met when Echanes visited Los Angeles and the Aaronsburgs to try to sell a historic Mexican printing press. And as they say, when he saw that Stendahl had pre-Hispanic objects, he said, "I can get those." Some of their communications was about acquiring books, but after 1939, the communication, which was very frequent, was primarily about Mexican antiquities. And although his company logo always showed a stack of books and a candle, his letterhead, at least as early as December 1940, includes archaeological objects among his advertised wares. And this is something that Mary Miller noticed yesterday when we were in the archives. I hadn't looked closely at his letterhead, even though I'd been looking at everyone else's. Now, many letters between the two men in 1940 and 1941 discussed new possibilities for acquisitions from both existing Mexican collections and from archaeological sites in multiple parts of Mexico, starting close at Teotihuacan and farther in the states of Veracruz, Yucatan, Campeche, and Chiapas. As Echanes wrote to Stendahl in November 1942, after 3 consecutive hot baths, I've managed to get most of the ticks off my skin. By regular mail, I'm sending you photos of the last acquisitions. So it appears he not only collected objects that already had been unearthed and in Mexican collections, but also commissioned new digging. As he wrote, "While a few guys do some digging, I go around the small towns in the chase of the wild goose. You will see and judge the total product of 28 days tour around Papantla, Poza Rica, Los Venados, Aguilillas, etc., etc. Now I can say that I know how to cover the field and how to take the hardships of the vagabond life." But Echanes needed money for this work and repeatedly asked Stendahl for money, either to pay for objects already sent to him or to help Echanes get more. As he wrote, so now you see it, I'll read it to you. As he wrote in September 1941 in capital letters, "What I need is money, money, and more money. The minute you see this kind of stuff I sent you in the last shipment, you will realize that I can work and obtain results beyond expectation if I have the dough." Or 3 months later, in December 1941, by telegram, wire money, 3 good pieces in sight. Stendahl was actively working to find that money by reaching out to potential clients. In Stendahl's letter to Matisse and other dealers, museum directors, curators, and private collectors, Stendahl reported about his new acquisitions and frequent trips to Mexico. In June 14, 1940, Stendahl wrote to Matisse, "I've just returned from a 2-month trip to the South." On April 11, 1941, he wrote, "I've just returned from a 5-week trip to Mexico. As usual, I overbought, but I'm happy to do it. I will be sending you some photographs in the near future," unquote. He also reported about shipments from Mexico, from which he started to obtain huge quantities of objects. As he wrote on that same day, April 11th, 1941, to Kurt Valentin of the Detroit Institute of Arts, "I will have 1,000 objects available in the next few months." This does not appear to have been an exaggeration. For customs documents, and I know you can't really see it, but this is just sort of an example, customs documents and associated paperwork itemize shipments containing hundreds of objects at a time. What is abundantly clear is that both Stendahl and Etchanis saw U.S. museums and collectors as sources of funds for new acquisitions from Mexico, I'm not going there yet, to keep the business alive, buy more objects, and arrange for more digging in archaeological sites. And we can cross-reference the dates of the letters between the two men, Etchanis and Stendahl, and between Stendahl and his clients, that the money from sales were going to Etchanis to continue his work. And Stendahl was quite explicit about getting money from particular collectors and prominent university and municipal museums in the US to finance Etchanis' work. He wrote potential clients, undertook cross-country tours to museums on the East Coast, lent objects to museum exhibitions, and planned exhibitions at his home gallery and elsewhere that displayed objects for sale and delivered a commission for museums that sold pieces from the shows. The details of these practices recall how Neil Brody has discussed the antiquities market, and I quote, "It's now clear that the antiquities market cannot be separated into legal and illegal components, but is better described as what criminologists call a gray market. Legitimate actors and actions facilitate the trade of illegally acquired artifacts in ways that have been collectively described as laundering. The legal and illegal markets cannot exist apart," unquote. And for the Stendahl Galleries, the sales were good. As he wrote to Matisse in 1941, "It's awfully hard to retain important pre-Columbian things. I've already made 3 trips this year. By this, you can understand that my sales have been very active." Of course, he used such rhetoric to convince people to buy immediately, since they might miss something good. But I imagine he was also ribbing Matisse, emphasizing his own success as Matisse's access to Mexican antiquities was waning. When Matisse reached out to Etchanis in 1942 to see what objects he had for sale, Etchanis responded, "Due to our previous contract, all sales to the US have to be done through the Stendahl Art Gallery of California, to whom we've referred your most welcome letter." Matisse thus turned to Stendahl to see what he had, buying from Stendahl in 1943 and 1944, since Stendahl was getting the goods. I must have missed a slide. There it is. I'll move back. Sorry. His archives retain their correspondence, including photos and letters, as well as Matisse's drawings of the pieces offered for sale. And this is another of the treasures of the Matisse archives when you see him as an artist, as the son of Henri Matisse, doodling on papers, drawing the pieces that he has received, and then choosing what he might want. The Stendahl Gallery archives also reveal information about how Etchanis and Stendahl removed items from Mexico. Although US laws did not yet prohibit importing Mexican antiquities, Mexican laws at the time prohibited their export from Mexico. As one might guess, Etchanis, Stendahl, and their network, and they use the word oiled or bribed, customs officials, and made sure they moved objects when friends were working the border. And I have to back up here, okay? For example, in May 1940, Etchanis wrote, Veracruz reports that our friend will be on duty from the 10th through the 20th, so if you want the shipment within that period, you will have to hurry. Otherwise, we do not know how long it will take. They also connected with a Mexican congressman to help and created other networks in Mexico and the US to assist in the movement of objects across the border. They also obtained consular invoices so that the items could be legally imported into the US using agents in Guatemala or in Guadalajara or in border cities to help them complete such paperwork. There are pages and pages of them in the Stendahl Gallery archives. And although Stendahl asked Echanes to be exclusive to him, Stendahl bought from other dealers in Mexico, including Spratling, Jorge Hauswalt, Alberto Marquez, and others. There are many, many in the archive. Another major source for the Stendahl Gallery in Mexico, originally via Echanes, were the Zaragoza brothers, who obtained hundreds of items from West Mexico to sell to Stendahl. The consular invoices lists hundreds of pieces, and we see them in photos too. Sorry for the quality of this photo, such as this astonishing array of 200 figures offered for 5,000 pesos. And as the consular invoices and other paperwork related to the Zaragoza show, Stendahl began to buy in bulk and later to sell in bulk. Such bulk business would continue and later moved to Costa Rica and Panama as Stendahl extended his networks to those countries in the late 1940s and 1950s. But they also knew they had to tread carefully. And I have to skip again, there we go. Since they knew that they could be caught and stopped. For a loan of a Chacmol sculpture to the De Young Museum in 1942, which Stendahl had bought from Echanes, here in Echanes's photo, which happens to be at the Matisse archive. No, the photo is at the Matisse archive, the letter is here. Stendahl wrote, "You can put a card on it, loaned anonymously, as I think it's best not to associate my name with it for the simple reason that it happens to be one of the most important things from Mexico, and I do not wish to run into complications." Unquote. We thus see in the archives intentional smuggling of pieces across borders and of Stendahl's concerns of becoming persona non grata in Mexico. Indeed, there were people in Mexico at the time and in subsequent decades, most notably Alfonso Caso, Cesar Lizardi Ramos, who were trying to stop the looting and the flow of antiquities out of their country. Now, discussions of World War II are less explicit but still present in the Stendahl Gallery archives of these years. As Stendahl wrote to Echanes in January 1942, this war has raised hell with the picture business, and some very important sales were canceled because of it. But in most letters, the political situation is in the background as Stendahl and Echanes write about politics, Roosevelt and the Russians, or their family, or playing gin rummy, all sorts of things. And then on the back of this letter from Echanes is, "Viva Roosevelt." Very curious. But it's clear that conflicts in Europe brought opportunity for the Stendahl Gallery to work more within the Americas, as artworks sent from Europe were reduced, and as Stendahl and others sought and found new economic opportunities that coincided with more interest in Mexico among potential collectors and museums, and diplomatic and cultural relationships as part of the good neighbor policy. In fact, comparable to what Saint-Ramond and Vaudry described for the Parisian exhibition of ancient American art at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs Palais du Louvre in 1928, that they say fed the market, the 20 Centuries of Mexican Art exhibition at MoMA in 1940, co-organized by Mexican and US curators and archaeologists, including Alfonso Caso, increased or fed the market in the US as people wanted to own objects just like those in the show, which we also see them writing about in the archives. Now, tonight I am only outlining the big picture, thinking about the larger networks. I will say that they reveal a great deal about individual objects and their trajectories, and such research will be the work of many people for years to come. International collaboration, all sorts of things. So where does this kind of research and new information leave us? For one, information is powerful, and it builds incrementally by accretion. By reconstructing and understanding these historical networks, we can begin to return the memory to objects of their possible origins and itineraries. And we can research what I call collective biographies, or how objects are related to each other, have been related to each other in antiquity and modern times, and examine how those relationships are salient to our perception of them today. We also must acknowledge that multiple countries share culpability in this trade, but we must also share the task of seeking information in archives, not only in the US, but also in Mexico and elsewhere, to continue efforts to track the object's trajectories and restore their memory. We must also listen more to our colleagues and friends in cultural heritage roles in Latin America and seek, through bilateral discussions and agreements, new modes of ownership of items now in foreign museums, as I know people in this room are doing. We must also seek models that allow Indigenous descendants more access to the work of their ancestors and agency in deciding what happens to them, as happened with the NAGPRA law for tribal nations in the US. But at the same time, we must remember the important roles that dispersed or dislocated objects can have outside their origin countries, used for education, artistic inspiration, and relationships with heritage for Indigenous people outside their homelands, and others who come to know these cultures and people through those objects, which can still function as active ambassadors for their makers' cultures. We must also not lose sight of the incredible artists who made those objects and continue to research them, the societies that created them, and evolved their descendants and other relations who may live in ancestral homelands in Mexico and Central America, or who have been dispersed, whether voluntarily or forced, to other places in the world, and whose very survival can be endangered both in their home countries and as they migrate across borders, as these objects did. We cannot turn back time and undo the object's dislocations or the disconnection of persons from the objects designed to accompany them in the afterlife. But we can honor those individuals and their relations by striving for more transparency, cooperation, and collaboration in researching the objects and their itineraries and restoring their memory, or at least some of it, such that they, and we too, can be sentient of both their history and their contemporary presence. Thank you.
I see that these microphones are on, and I actually have to say that I feel a little speechless, Megan. It's hard to know which part is the most painful. It's in some way to know the objects. We know that the objects have been ripped out of their context, but now to see the way that the European dealers, the owners, all of the dislocations of these objects, and all the people who owned these objects circa 1940 essentially are no longer on this planet. But here are these objects, and how do we deal with them? And how do we deal with them here in Los Angeles? In particularly the question of here. So you probably need to take a breath because that was just an amazing tour de force that took us to a place that very few of us knew about in terms of the history of the ownership and the narrative of pre-Hispanic art. And I'm looking out at this audience and at the many people who thought they knew the story. And some of you are nodding your heads at me right now. Why did this take root in Los Angeles? how is it that within a few years, so, we should be honest about the problems that Mr. Stendahl had at his gallery. He had an exhibition of Paul Klee in his gallery where he could not sell a picture. The California audience was pretty conservative. So what made them, starting in 1940 or so, say, cool, I want that in my house? What happens that turns this into a kind of household Southern California narrative? And while we let Megan continue to recover, I'm going to turn to Matthew.
Well, I'm still a little
Oh,
gobsmacked
and Matthew,
too.
do we know who you are?
Oh, yeah.
So, I introduced Megan, and let me introduce Matthew, who's the chief curator at the Fowler Museum, so just across the 405. And I should also say that over the past decade, and perhaps a little more, in different circumstances, Matthew, Megan, and I, all long before there would be any convergence in Southern California, have all been interested in following the story of the objects and the people who moved them. Matthew.
Yes. And I have to say, this really was a tour de force. Like this is not a story that from the Matisse side of it, it's sort of like you see these names in auction catalogs. You see, you try to piece it together, but to have the opportunity to hear you go through the archive. On the one hand, I want to say that this story has been hiding in plain sight. The archive is there, but at the same time, and these larger forces that you described so well about how World War II is really disrupting the lives of these individuals in the market for the material that they're selling, and it's like, well, of course, this makes perfect sense, but to have the deep dive and the close reading into the individual objects, into the individual dealers, was really just, I'm still kind of gobsmacked. It is this shift, though, that you've described with people like Matisse and Brummer, that this is this very small market in a way, that it's this very sort of elite market. It's people like Bliss, it's people like Ahrensburg, and the sort of smaller network of consumption that Pierre Matisse and Raton and Brummer are operating in, and the expansion of it, the quantity of material that it's sort of like, oh, we can get this stuff on the cheap. That Stendahl really does seem to have this kind of entrepreneurial awareness that is very, quote, for lack of a better term, very American, and that there's this constant desire to sort of find a way to market this material to new audiences. He goes around to the museums.
And there is a way that I would say that if you are the New York market, you think the world comes to you.
Yeah.
And if you are the Los Angeles market, you think, I better get my photographs and my suitcases in order because I'm going to get on the train, I'm going to go to Seattle, I'm going to go to Portland, I'm going to go to San Francisco.
Going to go to St. Louis.
I'm going to go to St. Louis. I have to get out there and market my materials in a way that is a kind of self-conscious New York is the world comes to us.
Well, one thing, just a little more details. I think he got in the station wagon and drove, and would have these long car trips, and I think the kids were in them too.
Was it a Woody?
I don't know, but I imagine it. That's what I picture in my head. But I'm sure if we ask Ron and April, they would know. And as April Damon talks about very well in her book, and as we see in some of these other letters, the prehistory of what I've been talking about from before 1938 and 39, of, for example, during the Depression, or all of the ways that Earl Stendahl was trying to find success. Trying with chocolates, trying with puzzles. They had a film business. They were involved in some sort of like color film at some point that fell apart. They tried mining. They tried all sorts of things. They had the California art, and then the pre-Hispanic art worked. And that's what's so interesting. Did Earl even know it when he started? Because he'd been trying these different things. And I think the idea of entrepreneur, April calls the book is art dealer as impresario. I think the entrepreneur is a really good word for him.
She calls it the exhibitionist.
And the exhibitionist, right. He was just so active and so busy, and the whole family was involved, that it was, they were packing things, they were constructing the packing boxes, driving the family down to Mexico, taking the family on digs in Panama, literally. That it was sort of this all-consuming thing. And I'm sure it was also him in relation to people in Hollywood who were stars and celebrities that
how did he get that access?
On the road too.
So, when you think about this man with a high school education from Wisconsin, how did he make common cause with the hotshots in Hollywood? How did that happen? And Matthew, I'm thinking about some of the work you've done.
Well, I mean, the part of the story that I know best is the slightly later part. The sort of more when he's pals with these guys, Vincent Price and Charles Lawton, and the Hollywood folks that form his clientele. I think that the earlier phase of the sort of like the more painting-oriented production, the interactions with the other modern artists, Millard Sheets is a key sort of transactional figure in all of this, in terms of maybe some of that entree into these worlds. But I also think, to sort of think about your points about New York versus Los Angeles, and it is the case, as you can read in the oral histories that are available from Stendahl and Price and Ahrensberg, that Los Angeles was a more conservative town when it came to appreciating modern art, which must have made the network that much closer, in a way, of people who actually did appreciate it, people who actually did want to see it. And so I wonder about that kind of overlap as a way to sort of think about how Stendahl sees it in these places, places it with these people, and then
who are the early adapters?
Well, right, and I think.
What does it take to get Billy Wilder to buy his first object?
Right. It's sort of you have to come up with the pitch that it's sort of like, oh, this is gonna look cool on your kind of kidney bean table. Who was the designer who did the Maya couches? Oh, yeah. Anyway, but a lot of this, for those of you who saw Found in Translation, a couple of years ago at LACMA, that there are these other connections between LA and Mexico, where these kinds of elite taste networks are starting to articulate ways of putting this material into a domestic environment that's not an elite domestic environment. It's a middle-class domestic environment, in a way. I want to be careful when I'm using, class terms about that, but I do think that there is this kind of post-war American story of consumption that this is playing a part of.
And by the way, this entire thing will be online whenever the Getty can review it, make sure that what our pictures are, and so it will be, this entire talk and the symposium tomorrow will all be available online, as with every Getty GRI symposium of this sort.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit. I think that, it was actually during the planning of the Found in Translation show, which was organized primarily by Wendy Kaplan and Decorative Arts at LACMA, when there were these conversations about they had these advisory boards coming in talking about Mexico and California, and I kept saying, what about collecting? Are you going to talk about collecting? And I said, well, I don't know. And they said, do you want to talk about collecting? And that's when, thinking about how important the people who were wearing Mexican-style dresses, or the people who were, thinking about traveling to Mexico. We're so close here in Los Angeles. That story of that relationship of Maya-style architecture in LA, other kinds of Neo-Aztec architecture in LA, that we are so close to, or I don't live here anymore, so close to Mexico, and the intimate relationships between the communities in LA and Mexico that I think was also a part of the story. Though some of it is hard to know how much were the people who were buying them thinking of Mexico, and how much were they just thinking, oh, this is this cool, unusual thing, right? After Cubists had looked at African art for inspiration, then surrealists thinking about ancient Americas and indigenous American art, and that just something unusual, something different, something as an alternative to European art. So I'm not sure about how much, when you had one piece on your bookshelf, how much were they thinking about Mexico, the indigenous artists who made these materials? I don't know. Some were and some weren't. Vincent Price is very, specific in sort of like he does want to have some kind of access to that artistic creativity.
But when does Vincent Price develop that interest?
He would say that he developed it quite early on, that he grew up in St. Louis and he went to Cahokia. He had an early experience in the Southwest.
And he was best friends with George Kubler in college.
And he went to high school with Morton May, the May Company in Wilshire and Fairfax, the major collector in St. Louis. So again, we're talking about a very restricted network of consumption in that moment, in sort of like 40s, even through the 50s a little bit.
So one of the things I find shocking is just to imagine a decade in which the acquisition practices of people could change so much. So in 1930, is there a pre-Columbian object in Southern California? Well, yes, probably a few.
I think, if I remember correctly, there is an Andean room at the Natural History Museum at the beginning of the 20s. So I'd have to double check.
And San Diego.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Christian Viella as I say this. San Diego is a major focus before 1930. But the difference between 1930 and 1940 is unbelievable as a transformation.
Right, and also what we're missing, the part of the story that I didn't tell, is also the history of World's Fairs, including ones in several places in the US, in Paris, in San Diego as well, from the 1915, what was it, the Pan-Pacific Exposition, you had them in the 1930s, so you also had these other kinds of expositions that were increasing people's interest as a way of exposing people to the world, also absolutely fed the art market as well.
How much of that did the two of you, when you're researching these show, the Stendahl and the Mexico, the Gamboa show that was traveling around, were they consciously drawing on those as on those World's Fairs as models for these kinds of massive exhibitions of material?
So you're asking if Stendahl was,
Yeah.
or if...
Or Gamboa.
Or both.
I would say yes, definitely. I mean, Fernando Gamboa from Mexico City was the curator of the 1958 exposition or the Mexican Pavilion in Brussels. And then
which won the fair, which won best art exhibition at the fair, which was just the fair. If you were alive in 1958, it was the first time objects like the Pietà had been seen since before the Second World War. So just to understand what an important fair that was in terms of the world's art.
But it's very clear that Stendahl was Earl Stendahl, and then his son Al and their other family members, that they were looking at museum catalogs as models. They were going to these exhibitions. They were going to the MoMA shows. They were going to and modeling that behavior.
Yeah.
The photographs are similar, the catalogs are similar, it's hard to tell the difference. When Mary and I were working on the essay for Found in Translation, we were following this series of catalogs for the Masterworks of Mexican Art exhibition that was a Mexican show that traveled in Europe in, 13 cities. And then there was a Stendahl show that followed closely behind, and we just couldn't figure out. It's like, wait, why are there other objects all of a sudden appearing? Until we realized that the shows had combined the Mexican government show and the dealer's show in the same museum at the same time. So they were very intentionally, from the beginning, using the visual language of museums and exhibitions to use for their exhibitions. But it's something that's not, I thought that that was unique to them, and then I started looking back.
Right.
Matisse was doing it, Raton was doing it, and I'm sure there are many others before, earlier in the 20th century as well as the 19th century. This, we have this porousness in between the market and then the museums.
What I think is so interesting about this as a Los Angeles phenomenon is that it is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it is the first moment when a set of materialities and in the hands of one particular gallery put Los Angeles at the center of the art market universe. So it's not in London or in Paris or Berlin or New York, it's now Los Angeles. And eventually they will lose that primacy because it's a little bit like telling a mobster story, that the New York crowd will come back and there will be a revenge tragedy. But there's going to be a great 25-year run in which Los Angeles owns this narrative. And it is so exciting to be able to mine that narrative and to understand how it changes the history of collecting in the world and how it affects the history of archaeology in Mexico. And I think there are many aspects of this that have not been publicly acknowledged about the devastation that this wreaks on Mexican archaeological sites, when the possibility of this and the success of Los Angeles depends on the ability to wreak destruction on archaeological sites in Mexico.
Yeah, and what's so interesting to see is how so many people were complicit in this, whether they knew it or not. Or they were just, as you say, it's hiding in plain sight, or people just weren't asking questions, right? Because you see these, Echana says, I need more money, right. And then he says, and I'm not gonna name names right now. I will at some point later. So, oh, well, I just got 500 from this museum, or I just got 2,000 from that museum, from that collector, and there's a very direct relationship between that money that's obtained and then it going back to Mexico for whether to buy, some of these were already collections that existed that people wanted to sell, and then others were actively, acquired. Doug?
So there's this way in which Stendahl is kind of seeding the market at both ends, that he's sort of priming the pump for the museums. He's facilitating, sort of like in these letters that he writes to directors, as we've been looking at over the last couple of days. I sell things to Robert Woods Bliss. I sell things to Walter Ahrensberg. Perhaps you'd like to see my wares. There is this kind of traveling salesman aspect to it.
And he's so good at it. And Matisse is not, I think, right. In the same way.
Right, but so then it's sort of like, so you see it there, you see it in the background of, your Alfred Hitchcock movies and Batman television shows and what have you. And the degree to which Stendahl is sort of actively seeding those kinds of design opportunities is something I think that we'll still have to figure out. Like if you see a Costa Rican Jaguar metate on one of these tables, in a sort of like keep your modernist, bedroom free of clutter kind of advertisement, that's happening as early as the 1940s. So there's this way in which they're stimulating demand already for what would happen in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, I have no idea what kind of salesperson Matisse was, because he ended up being very successful with European art. And I'm sure there may be people in this room who've worked on that aspect of his sales. And I think it really is just Stendahl coming in, and as Matisse said, as Stendahl said, as Achana said, they all stated Stendahl cornered the market, and he pushed out other people who were trying, for better or for worse, to succeed in this particular market.
I would say that one of the problems is that the market he cornered would ultimately not be the market. He would corner this market that's up here behind us, would not be the market where some part of the intellectual orbit would decide circa 1970 where the action was. And so things would change, and he would remain a player, but he would not be the one who had cornered the market. Well, you know, we've kept you here until 8:30, and I think we promised to let you go even before this. We hope that you'll be returning for a really engaging day tomorrow, in which we're going to find out the ways in which pre-Hispanic materials are acquired in Europe and the United States and in Mexico in order to bring them into a kind of canonical form that we see in the 21st century, looking backward, but with particular attention to before 1940. We think we have an interesting story to tell you tomorrow. If you are not signed up for our symposium and you'd like a seat tomorrow, my guess is that you can still do so online tonight, and we would welcome you back with open arms. So thank you so much for coming.